Welcome again to this evening's satsang, Living Wisely, Living Well. I would like to begin our satsang this evening with a reading from the book Living Wisely, Living Well by Swami Kriyananda. Learn when to stop, whatever you are doing. If speaking, learn to stop when you've said enough. And if writing, don't drag on beyond your point once you've made it. People often think, if I can say just a little more, I'll succeed better in convincing them. After leading your listeners to the top of a cliff, but what more can you do except push them over the edge? Swami Kriyananda took great care when he was speaking, he took great care when he was writing, and especially when he was editing his writings. He would often tell us that he would go over his writings when he was editing a book, one of the many 150 or so books that he wrote, that he would go over it over and over and over again. Some people thought that, he would, because he did produce books quite frequently, and many books a year, people thought he would just go over them and they were done. But no, it wasn't the case. He would write, and then he would edit, and he would go over because it was important to him that he was able to say very precisely exactly what he wanted to say. He wanted to take care to put it in writing and to be very, very clear. And he said the same thing about when he spoke. He tried to make the teachings of his guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, he tried to make them very clear and seemingly simple to understand. Now that doesn't mean that the teachings are simple, and it doesn't mean what he was writing was simple. But he tried to express them in such a way so that people could understand them and as simply as possible. You know how it is. You read books, you hear discourses, and it seems like some presenters try to make things sound complicated. The more obscure, the better, is seemingly the motto, you might say, for people. It makes it sound perhaps more intelligent, or perhaps the speaker more intelligent that way, if they present it that way. But Swami was not like that. He wanted us to be very clear and simple and to the point. Now, there was a reason for that, because words, he said, have power. Words have power, and just as if you're listening to somebody and they're very verbose and they use 100 words, which could be said in 10, each of those words loses their power, and you begin to, as you listen, you begin to tune out that person. They go on and on and on. I know when I write something, I'll write it and I'll be very free in my first draft of writing. But then when I go back, I almost always see that I use too many adjectives and too many modifiers. I said it more often than I needed to, and I go back and I begin to pare it. Well, we should try to do that not only when we write, of course, to be as clear as possible, but we should also do that when we're speaking as well. We should try to be clear in what we're trying to say. And we'll find that if we're clear, we begin to convey power with the words that we use. And this is how Swami Kriyananda was with his words, and this is how we also should take as an example. There's a story from the life of Saint Anthony of the Desert. Saint Anthony lived a couple hundred years after Christ's time, and he lived in North Africa in the wilds of the desert there as a hermit. And he lived there, he lived beyond the age of 100, and at least 80 of those were spent in the desert, pretty much in solitude at that time. He was an anchorite, but he was also a great saint, and he developed great sanctity in his life, and his renown traveled out throughout the Mediterranean world, and people were attracted to moving to the desert, and he was the founder of what became a desert tradition at that time of people moving out into the desert fathers as they're called. Well, St. Anthony in his life, it was at a time when in the early days of the Christian religion in the church, the Catholic Church that was forming at that time, there was a number of various schisms, various sectarian arguments of the nature of Christ, the nature of Christ consciousness, how the religion should be presented. And one of these schisms arose, and the bishop in Alexandria at that time was faced with something of a split in the congregation. It was very emotional, and a great deal of discord and disharmony was coming into the church at that time throughout the entire Christian world. So the bishop, Athanasius was his name, knew of St. Anthony, and he went deep into the desert to find him. And he found St. Anthony, and he asked him to come back to Alexandria to help resolve this dispute that was raging at the time. And it was not St. Anthony's wish to do so, but he was obedient to the bishop, and he agreed to come. And so in his very simple attire as a desert, you can imagine living there, probably long beard, long hair at that time, anchorite, he came into Alexandria. And the church, the main cathedral, was where the dispute at that time, the debate was taking place, raging quite disharmoniously. So Anthony came into the church in the middle of the dispute, and he was a very striking figure. And as he came in, he walked to the front, and people seeing him, they stopped and they looked, and they could see there was something different about this man. And Anthony came up, and he was invited up to the pulpit at the front. And he came up to the pulpit, and he said 4 words: "I have seen him," meaning Jesus Christ. This was 200 years, of course, 300 years after Christ's death. "I have seen him." But he said that with the power of many, many decades, scores of decades of meditation, personal inner experience behind him. And there was such power in those words that the dispute ended. Now, our words too need to have that power. And we don't want to speak to the degree that we lose that power. We want to be able to convey that. And that power, what Swami Kriyananda said, we should try to express in what we say, in what we write, we should try to express what he called crystal clarity. Use restraint, but be clear. Say what you mean, and mean what you say, whether it's in the spoken word or whether it's in the written word. And you'll find that if you're very clear, your words will begin to have power, and in that power, your words will begin to have magnetism as well. And this is a principle that is applied also to our general organizational life, if we work in an office, if we're in charge of projects. If we're clear about our intent, we'll find that the project has magnetism. Oftentimes, people speak too much, they write too much, because their thinking is fuzzy. They don't quite know what to say, and so they feel that if I say more of it, somehow I'll be able to convince somebody else. Or perhaps they say too much because they're trying to beat you over the head, or as Swamiji was saying in this reading, push you over the cliff. Well, this isn't the way to win people. Oftentimes you'll find less is better rather than more is better when it comes to speaking or communication. But the goal, whatever we say, is to be clear. And in that clarity, we'll begin to be magnetic in what we present. Now, in order to be clear, in order to practice restraint, we need to have, which is a self-control, which is another, you could say, topic that this reading today opens up, how to have self-control. And this is self-control, not in speaking alone, but self-control of the life force and the energy that each of us possess within ourselves. And if we have self-control, we'll be able to consciously use that life force and apply that life force into ways that are useful for us and effective in our outer life as well, not only as the inner life. I read a very interesting, no, I didn't read, I watched a documentary recently about a group of people that are teaching meditation in prisons. And in America, there's a very high security prison in one of the states, Alabama in this case. And they introduced meditation to a group of prisoners who had volunteered to participate in a very intensive program. And you could say, of course, the volunteers in this case had a lot of time on their hands. And so being in prison, so a group of them wanted to participate. And it was very interesting that the success of this program and some of the comments that the prisoners shared afterwards, it did turn out to be very successful generally. So much so that the prison expanded the program to include a larger number of people. And they found a decrease in stress and they found a decrease in antisocial behavior and infractions and so on. But one of the comments that struck me is one of the prisoners, when asked about what he had gained from this program, said, "I'm so happy. I learned that I can create a space in my life between impulse and action." That space between impulse and acting on that impulse. And you could see many prison inmates lack that ability, and that's why they end up in prison. But although we may not end up in prison, it's also something we might want to learn too. We have impulses, we have things that come into our lives, circumstances, and we act on them without creating that little bit of space. And this is exactly why we meditate. Now, there are other reasons as well, but we meditate in order to create that space. And in that space, between an impulse, a thought, an impression coming into our life, and before we act, now this might be this much, but yet we have a space for consciousness to enter in, and in that consciousness, we can choose our action. We choose our response to that impulse. And this is an expression of what's taking place in the brain. Instead of simply acting from the lower centers in the brain, we transfer our consciousness from those lower impulsive side of the brain to the point between the eyebrows or to the frontal lobes of the brain. And when our consciousness is centered there, we find that then we can be conscious and we can make conscious choices. And when we can make conscious choices, one of those choices can be the ability to be in control of ourselves, the ability to be able to stop when we wish to stop or to go when we wish to go. Now, bringing the consciousness to the frontal lobes of the brain or the point between the eyebrows, the spiritual eye, this is the beginning. It doesn't guarantee that we're going to make good choices. But before you can make a good choice, you have to have the ability to choose. And that's what we're doing when we learn to meditate. Now, this also touches on another quality or another avenue of Raja Yoga that I'd like to mention. This is also the ability to choose, the ability to take control of our lives. This is what is meant when we hear the word tapasya. Tapasya often has a somewhat in people's minds a negative impulse or a negative reaction with people's thinking, and people misunderstand what tapasya is. Some people, you say the word and they think of the yogi or the Kumbh Mela where the fellow has his hand up and doesn't take it down. Some austerity such as that, or perhaps laying on the bed of nails, or sitting in the ring of fire, or some sort of self-discipline that generally speaking, is unpleasant. And this is how we think of it. And so who wants to do tapasya? Or it's austerity, you could say. There is something difficult in life. But what is tapasya really? I mean, these are exercises to be able to train ourselves. And tapasya, self-restraint, self-discipline, these are muscles that have to be strengthened. And to strengthen a muscle, you have to exercise it. And so it's often good to do things that are going to be able to exercise that muscle to make it stronger. But tapasya, better defined, is taking deliberate control of our inner energies. Taking control, being able to do something consciously, being able to apply ourselves in this direction, to apply ourselves in that direction, or to not apply ourselves in those directions. And this often is more important than the where we do apply them, at least in the beginning stages. Paramahansa Yogananda would say, we all need to develop our willpower, but we also need to develop our won't power as well. So you have to be able to restrain and then apply, but that implies control of our inner energies. This tapasya is that exercise of that. And in the exercise of that tapasya, in the exercise of control, we begin to gain a power. And this is why the fruits of tapasya are said classically in Raja Yoga. Patanjali defines them as the gaining of those inner powers, those siddhis, those psychic powers. But I don't mean it in that sense. But nevertheless, there is power. And power is one of the aspects of God. Just as light, just as sound, just as peace and love and calmness, these are aspects of God. Power, too, is an aspect of God, and we need to have power in our life to be effective. So many people, it seems sometimes they come to the spiritual path, they come to the yoga path, they come to the meditative path, and it remains on a philosophical level, and it's somewhat vague in their mind, rather than being concrete and effective. And people have a little bit of a fanciful notion. We need to be able to translate those ideals, those things we believe in, that philosophy must be translated into practical application of expression in our outward life. Otherwise, it's merely an abstraction. It's merely a good thought, which we begin with those thoughts, but thought must come down from the causal plane into that plane of action, of energy, and expressing outwardly. So we want to meditate, we want to express those ideals that we have outwardly, and this takes power. This takes, in the sense of, it takes self-control. It takes the ability for us to control the inner flow of our life force and apply it this way, apply it that way, or perhaps not in the other ways. Now, if we take even one further step back, before we can control something, we have to be aware of it. There's a phrase in yoga, you may have heard this, we repeat it many times, that awareness precedes control. If you're going to control something, you need to be aware of something. So consequently, a person that just jabbers and jabbers and jabbers and talks way too much, they're probably not even aware of it sometimes. They're not aware of the power that they have, that they're expressing, and they dissipate it. So we need to be aware, self-aware of what we're doing in life, but then also inwardly aware of the force, of life force within ourselves. And as we begin to become aware inwardly of that life force, we then take it to the next step of learning to direct it consciously. And this is why we meditate, to gain that awareness, but also we meditate to be able to gain that space, to be able to allow us to control our life force, to allow us to be able to control our life. And as I said, it's like a muscle. And how to learn to become perhaps more self-controlled. We start with something in our life. Start with something simple. And I think each of us, all of us, you might say, are faced with dilemmas in life and choices in life. And we can always take the easy way out to whatever one of our choices, or we can take perhaps the direction in our life we know is a little bit more difficult for us, and perhaps even more right. We know it's the right way, but oh, that little, you might say, that little angel on one shoulder, little devil on the other shoulder is whispering in her, take the easy way out. Take the easy way out. It's easier this way. And the little angel is saying, no, do the right thing. Don't listen to that little devil on the one shoulder. Try to do that which you know is right, even if it's a little bit harder. And even when it is a little bit harder, sometimes that's an indication that perhaps it's the better way to go. Not necessarily, but it can be. So in your life, choose something that perhaps is a little bit of a stretch, a little bit more difficult, and do it. Yogananda said, bite off more than you can chew, and chew it. And in the doing of that, you'll begin to develop your power of will. And through the development of the power of the will, you'll be able to apply that to your own self and to be able to develop self-control. And again, taking something small. Say you have, there are certain foods sometimes, if I find myself on the scale and perhaps I'm gaining a few pounds too many, I choose a few things and I look at my diet and I say, I'm not going to eat that one and I'm not going to eat that. I just cut them out. And I don't, as many people do, and this is why they fail so much at, for example, dieting, they have such a high ideal that it's impossible for them to sustain their self-control, their ability to accomplish it. Take something that you have a good idea that you can actually accomplish and do that and be successful at it. You see, this is important. If success will breed further success, then you take something more and you do that. And again, something more and you do that. And as you develop success, you'll find that that muscle of self-discipline, that muscle of self-control will begin to grow. And as it grows, you begin to develop a greater and greater will. Your sense of self-control, your sense of willpower begins to grow. One caution: if you're going to take up a challenge, which is what life is about, it's one challenge after another one, and a life without challenges is not going to be a successful life. But if you do take up challenges, inevitably you will fail at some of those challenges. Or you could say you won't succeed. But when that happens, when you stumble and you've bitten off more than you can chew and find that you have to spit it out, don't say, I have failed. Say, I have not succeeded yet. Swami Kriyananda would usually, when he made that point, he would use the example of smoking, because when he was a college student, he took up smoking for a short period of time. And nicotine being what it is, it's habit forming. And so he formed a habit. But he knew that he didn't want to be a smoker. And he tried to quit. And as Mark Twain did say, Mark Twain said, so smoking is the easiest thing in the world to quit. I've done it 1,000 times. And the reason, the joke being there, of course, you quit and it's addicting, so you go back to it and you fail again and again. But Swamiji said he never thought of himself as failing. He said, I just have not succeeded yet. You try, banat, jai. And eventually you succeed, you get to where you're going. And so this is something to keep in mind when you're applying yourself to whatever exercises of self-discipline that you choose. Don't think in terms of failure. take one thing. Don't take too many things. Many people have such high ideals of what they want to, how they want to perfect themselves, that they give themselves tasks beyond their capacity. Take one or two or just a few things to try to improve yourself with that is going to challenge and strengthen that muscle of self-control, of self-discipline, and you'll find something interesting happen. If you can take just one or two things and make a success of them, it will translate into other areas of your life. It's not as if, let's say, dieting, for example, or perhaps getting up early in the morning. If you're successful getting up early in the morning, somehow that muscle of self-control is strengthened enough so that you'll find that you can restrain yourself from those sweets that you want to give up, or it'll allow you to remember to be a little bit more orderly in your life, or whatever it might be. You'll find perfection or success in one small area will translate naturally into the other areas, and then you can begin to expand. So take one thing and then expand it. Now, on the spiritual life, this is a very important thing. I mean, it's yoga emphasizes this element to some degree of self-discipline, self-control, learning when to stop, restraint, these types of things. These are important because of power. And why do we want power in this sense, the ability to control ourselves inwardly, to direct our energies? It takes self-control and it takes power to find God. Think of it this way. What are we trying to do when we follow the spiritual life? As we say in our purification ceremony, open your heart to me, the Master says, and I will enter and take charge of your life. Is it easy to open your heart to God? It's not. It's not easy. Is it easy to meditate and keep your mind uplifted? No, it's not, because we live in a world where there is a force and a drag pulling us in the opposite direction. And in order for us to resist that and apply ourselves to where we want to go in life, we have to have inner strength. It takes power to give yourself to God. It takes power to surrender to God. It takes inner strength to be a devotee. You won't look at the life of any great saint and look at their lives and see, were they weak? No, they were not. They had a great inner power, and that power was able to translate outwardly, wordlessly even, to be able to influence other people, because that power translated into magnetism to influence other people and circumstances, and that magnetism is what attracts the divine to us. We attract God to us. We attract circumstances to ourselves. We attract the blessings. We go to the temple and we want to receive those blessings. It takes more than just simply passively asking for those blessings. We have to ask with a certain divine power. My will attuned to God's will. And that power to attune is what comes. Learning self-control, learning to be able to direct and control our energies in the right way. First, we start, might say, as a child in kindergarten, and then we graduate higher and higher until ultimately we, from the practice realm of learning to attract things in our outward life, we learn to attract God. Master said an interesting thing. If you do not have the power to attract outwardly that which you need in life to sustain yourself, if you don't have that power, you're certainly not going to have the power to attract God. And this is what we want to develop in ourselves. And it starts from the very simple day by day application of self-control, day by day, asking God to help us, not by my will alone, God, but by my will, sustained and supported by your will. And together we'll be able to accomplish great things. Many blessings to you all. Namaste.